Hi, I'm Heather Hubbard. I went from being a lawyer and partner at one of the largest firms in America to becoming an online personality and successful entrepreneur. I know what it takes to rise to the top. I also know all too well the toll it can take on your health and personal life. So, how do you shine bright without burning out? How do you chase joy while achieving success? You're listening to the Hustle and Flow podcast. Welcome back to Hustle and Flow. I am your host, Heather Hubbard, and today we have special guest Kori Carew. She is an attorney, TEDx speaker, and community builder who generates awareness and understanding of critical human issues by creating the space and climate for open dialogue that is meaningful and enables people to expand their perspective and drive positive change. With grace and truth, she is a people inclusion strategist, advocate, speaker, coach, writer, status quo disruptor, truth teller, wife and mother of two curly haired, wise, energetic, fierce Spitfire daughters. She brings an incisive voice, unapologetic questioning of the status quo, and a lifelong fascination of human potential to empowering women and historically marginalized and excluded people. She is a repeat guest. You may remember her from episode 146, Authenticity and Belonging in Corporate America, which we recorded in January of 2020. That is unbelievable.
We
And
had no
over the
idea what
last
was coming, did we?
Right. No, not at all. And so over the last 4 or 5 years, we've gotten to know each other better. She was at the Joy in the Journey Miraval retreat earlier this year. And the more I get to know her, the more I get to spend time with her. I just feel so blessed to have her in my life. And so you're going to get that blessing today. So welcome back, Kori.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you for having me on your podcast. Even more than that, thank you for all the beautiful things that you put out into the world every single day through your programs, through your retreats, and just you being you. So,
Oh, thank you. I feel the same way about you. This is a love fest, y'all. All right. So when we think, but I had to look this up when I was like, when did we last, have you on the podcast? And I'm like, wow, so much has changed
mm,
since that time.
mm.
And it was interesting because I haven't had to go back and listen to it. I was like, what were we even talking about in January of 2020? Because that seemed like a lifetime ago.
Mhm.
I'm curious from your perspective in corporate America and just the world at large, what have you seen as the biggest shifts in corporate America when it comes to things like authenticity and belonging and courage?
I think in the corporate space, we've gotten a lot more comfortable talking about authenticity
Hmm.
and talking about the importance of authenticity. I don't know that we have gotten better in understanding what it is and what it isn't,
Hmm.
right? I think we still are in a space where some people think that authenticity means not necessarily having regard for others, right? And I'm going to overlap this with a conversation on inclusion
Hmm.
because, for so long we've talked about inclusion and belonging and creating spaces where people can be their authentic selves. And more, we seem to have people who seem to think that, well, you should just make space for my authentic self when my authentic self is being a butthole or a jerk or a bigot, right?
Hmm.
And and
Hmm.
and people seem to think that inclusion means all voices are entertained and welcomed, even when some of those voices are voices of hate or division or misinformation or lies. And so it's almost as if these beautiful things that are intended to bring beauty into the world are being weaponized against the very beauty that we're trying to create. So, to answer your question, I think we are more and more talking about authenticity and accepting it and believing it to be normalized. At the same time, there's still a lot of confusion about what it is. The same with courage. I don't know that we're talking about courage in ways that are truly practical and ways in which people can, what's the word that I'm looking for? What's the word for when you operationalize? I'm not sure we're talking about them in ways that people can operationalize it daily, even though we may be using the word more. And I think
Mhm.
that's an important distinction because sometimes I find when I'm in conversations with people and I say we need more courage, I don't, it's a word that has such different meanings for people that doesn't translate. I'll give one example. There was a general counsel and a friend of mine who's a chief inclusion and diversity officer, diversity, equity, inclusion officer, whatever the title is at her firm. And the three of us were talking, and he said, what do we think the biggest challenge is that has been to this work and why we haven't made the progress that we want to have made over 20 years? And she gave her answer, and I said, I think it's a lack of courage. And from his reaction, I could tell there was almost a visceral reaction to it. And part of that is because until we break down what we mean when we're talking about courage and what we mean in terms of courageous leadership and how we show up courageously, we're not connecting. People think of disruption as if it can only happen in confrontational, angry ways. People think of courage and they always think of it as these big, burn it all down things. And
Yeah.
sometimes that is courage, but sometimes courage is even just choosing to say no. Courage is choosing to say, well, yeah, we did it 5 times and it didn't work, but let's try again. And sometimes it's this is what everybody wants us to do, and this is the popular view, but it's not the right one. It's not the right decision. So, no, we're not going to do it. Right? It's saying this option maybe would make us more money in the short term, but good leadership is finite thinking and long term thinking and making the decision that may hurt in the moment but is going to be more aligned with who we are, the values of who we say we are, and where we're trying to go. That also is courage.
Yeah.
And we don't talk about courage in those ways.
Well, when I think about things that have shifted in corporate America, and as you and I both know, and I think most people listening, I'm not really in corporate America too much. I sometimes will work with those in corporate America, but just as an outsider looking in, it seems as though maybe back in the 2020s, we very much we were still it seemed as though we were still in the era of we were pushing for change related to equality and equity, and most people seemed at least open to it, even though we weren't necessarily making the progress we wanted to make, and it could be really frustrating. But most people were they would say they were open to it. And now we are at a point where we have the like Tractor Supplies, we have the Lowe's who are coming out and saying, no, we are doing away with our diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. And it's a very interesting place to be because I now do not understand their values. Because did their values change, or was it just lip service? Do they only care about the whim of whoever is the loudest at the moment? And I agree with you. Some people are like, well, that is courageous that they're saying we're not doing the DEI thing. And it's like, well, why were you doing it in the first place if you weren't actually committed to it? And to me, it's not courageous. It's one confusing because I now don't know your values nor trust your values. And I feel like you're not having the courage to stand on what I thought you believed. I'm just curious, how you perceive these corporations suddenly changing their stances.
Yeah. So I think two things. One, there are people who will argue that maybe they're not really changing, that there's a lot more going on behind the headlines that may not be as represented by the headlines. So let's put that there, right?
Okay.
Without getting into the substance of, are they really, are the headlines misleading, or are they accurate, or, let's put that aside. At its core, being courageous is aligning behavior and action to values. It's living out the values that we say we are committed to. I think we have to be honest with ourselves and recognize that not all of the people in 2020 who said they were committed to anti racism and racial equity were telling the truth. It's not something that we want to admit, but it's true. And in many of these organizations, if you talked to the people, they would tell you there are many of us who have worked in organizations where what the organization says it's committed to and the experiences that people have day to day don't align.
Right.
We've gone to work at those places, right? We've all worked at places that got awards
Oh,
for
yeah.
gender equity while we were experiencing things day to day. We've worked with people who externally were DI champions, but gaslit the shit out of us and sent us to therapy.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
so that part has always been true. One of the things that we can do is begin to think about, corporations are fictitious identities, but they're made up of people. And within our organizations, there are people across the spectrum. There are people who are really committed to creating spaces where everyone can thrive, where equity is something that we strive for because people matter. All people matter. And then there are others who maybe were silent because they did not feel like they could speak, but never really were on board, but acted like they were on board. And then there are people in between. So I used to often get questions when I was in house, and people would say, so are they really committed to this? And by that, this, they mean, equity and inclusion and belonging. When I would travel, are they really committed? And the response I always had was, well, how are we defining committed? And that may sound like a lawyer answer, like, oh my God, there goes the lawyer playing with words.
Yeah.
But here's what I mean. You have a goal, you say you have a goal, but how committed are you to it? How committed are you to the change? Now, there's some organizations, their commitment is, sure, we'll sign on for that if that means you can do ABC. But if you're going to come and tell me that we have to change the structure of how we're doing things and I have to change my behavior, that I'm not interested in. So I'm willing to go to the doctor and say, I need to be healthier. And the doctor says, Kori, in order for you to be healthier, here are a few things that you need to change. And Kori may say, well, that sounds all good, doctor, but I'm not giving up my bourbon daily, right?
Yeah.
But I'll do this part, but I won't do this part. And many of our organizations are like that. And so the idea of, are we really committed to this? Are we aligned to this? It's so, in many spaces, it's like, well, how committed are you? Are you committed to the behavior change part? Are you committed to the organizational change part? Are you committed to align your money to these stated values? And what we're seeing is a prioritization of what the values are. And if I'm going to get a small vocal minority attack me on social media, then I'm willing to push this aside for some folks. And then for others, they're like, you know what? We're going to double down because this is important. This goes to the core of who we are. But the dilemma is, The dilemma is, in the meantime, real people are being impacted. Real people are being impacted. Their careers are being impacted. Their sense of belonging is impacted. Their sense of inclusion is being impacted.
I remember, I was in a law firm 10 years ago, which is kind of wild. But, we were talking about belonging, inclusion then, but again, everyone was the discourse was not as angry or divisive as it is now. And I hear people who, like, I have many clients, right? Who do have to I've created a business where I don't really work with people who don't share my values because I lead so much with my values. But I have
Yeah.
plenty of clients who go to work at places where, what really are the values of the company and the people who work there are very different. And so even walking in the day after the election
Hmm.
and, a group of white men celebrating, but then getting really quiet when someone walks by that they know would not be supportive. And and then of course we have whatever is going to happen with the next 4 years. And we say we can't talk about politics. And
Hmm.
yet every person, the clients whom I work with that are in the corporate space, they're dealing with this more on a daily basis than they ever have
Yes.
because people are so vocal, and politics in many ways doesn't feel like politics. It just feels like social issues. And a, a lot of people, and I wonder if companies know, and maybe they do, but how many women, and especially women of color, are really struggling with showing up to work and wondering whether or not just to opt out because it feels so exclusive and harmful right now.
Thank you for bringing that up. I have said this for a long time. I think the first time I said this was after Pulse. I remember, at that time, law firms were not making statements, and my law firm was one of the only ones that made internal statements and did something after Pulse happened. I don't know if you remember Pulse
Yep.
in Orlando.
Yep.
Um, People were killed
Yeah.
simply because they were gay in a space that was supposed to be a safe space for them, because the external world was not safe. So this was a place where they could go and they could be themselves and actually enjoy themselves. And I remember at that time saying that it is an immense privilege to be able to just label things politics and say, well, that's politics. We don't talk about that. We don't address that. Because for the things that one person can label politics, for others, they're real life issues. And so even when a family member sends me an email saying, I didn't vote based on social issues, it confuses me. Like, what is a social issue to you? I'm confused. We're talking about whether people may lose their citizenship. So help me understand, because that's a real life issue. We're talking about trans people's rights. So, that's real life, right? We're talking about bodily autonomy. We're talking about the sense of safety and belonging and security and identity. So it's not just political, and it's not just social issues. These are real. These are people issues that impact how you wake up and how you show up. When someone has directed hate towards people who look like me, or people who look like those that I love, or people that I go to church with, or I worship with, right? Or I am community with. When you stand behind that, or you say you can ignore that for any other reason, it is it is absurd to not think that those people in those groups are not questioning their safety around you, right? Because now I'm showing up to work and I'm wondering, which one of you thought that whatever you were choosing was worth the potential harm to either me or those I love? Especially if for people like me who focus on the idea of belonging, like you do, which is that we want to create a circle of belonging where the human dignity of each person is recognized and valued, in which you can have a political difference, a political perspective that is different than mine, but your rights to belonging and liberty and freedom are protected, right? That's not what we're talking about here. And that's what people miss when they try to reduce this down to just political differences, right? Because never before have we seen this feeling, at least in our lifetime. Let me qualify that. Never before with political differences and other elections have people felt this sense of, whoa, this is quite unsafe. Um,
Right.
and so that's what's different. That's what's different. And it is fair for people to maybe show up to work and not necessarily feel safe, because maybe they really aren't safe. Maybe they really aren't safe. Because if we go to work and we've been talking for 10 years, 15 years about allyship, what does allyship really mean? This is the big allyship. What does allyship really mean? And so I think we're in a time where this idea of courage is needed even more than ever. The courage for us to say, othering is sky high, because that's what's happened. People have been othered. People have been convinced that the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion is actually a work of hierarchy, right? They've been convinced
Yeah.
that the work of equity is actually the opposite of what it is. They've been convinced that us trying to make sure that you have a voice is the same as silencing them. And that's never been the work of equity,
Right.
but somehow that's the propaganda that has taken root and sowed division. So the work of the future now is, well, how do we bridge that gap? Right? Because the Heathers still have to go to work, the women of color still have to go to work, and they still have to go to work with people who are celebrating what others may feel like a real threat
Right.
to their identity, to their rights in many ways. How do we bridge that gap? And it requires a level of courage. It requires a level of us having conversations about what exactly are our values. Because I bet both groups would tell you that they both believe in equality and equity. But what does that mean? Because apparently we're not using the same definitions. We've seen some of the bills. There are some of these bills that are talking about equity work as being oppression against some
Right.
people. Now, we shouldn't be surprised by that, because we saw racism be redefined from what it is to where now just talking about race or recognizing racial differences is racism. We've seen a
Y-
redefining of history to where even just teaching accurate history is
That's
being
what I was
deemed
going to say.
un-American and
Yep.
unpatriotic. So we shouldn't be surprised. The word woke, which comes from African American culture and means something specific, has been so bastardized and weaponized against communities of color. And the people who weaponize it can't even define what it is. They can't tell you what it is, but they know how to use it as a slur. So we shouldn't be surprised that DEI has been co opted in this way. But then the question that I have, Heather, is if we had been courageous earlier in taking on not allowing DEI to be redefined, and taking on addressing the propaganda, and taking on evangelizing what diversity, equity, inclusion means and how it benefits everyone and how belonging is for everyone. If we had done that then, would we be here now? And that's almost an academic question. But the bigger question is, how do we move from here? Because a lot of people are afraid, and they're rightfully afraid. If you're an immigrant, yeah, you should be afraid, whether you're documented or not.
Yeah. The election has only been what, 1 or 2 weeks away 2 weeks ago with you and I recording this interview. Although in in many ways it feels like it was a year ago. I've noticed this with myself and I've witnessed it in others of this, you know, a feeling of defeat
Mm,
and a feeling of how do we ever convince people? Can things change? And so I'm curious from your perspective what courage does look like right
mhm,
now,
mhm,
over the next 4 years. And not to make this too complicated, but what does courage look like for the person who is showing up to work and is not in a management role? And what does
mhm.
courage look like for a person who is in a management or leadership role during these times right now?
I think courage in the immediate short term, it's going to sound very counterintuitive, looks like rest.
Mm,
Because I think we've got a tough season coming up. It's no coincidence when we see a spike in certain things, in hateful behavior. It's not a coincidence that some of that has spiked. Those texts that people have received talking about reports into the cotton plantation,
yeah.
that's not a coincidence. And so for those who have minimized the concerns that others have, it's like, well, the proof is in the pudding. And we saw the same thing in 2016, right? So in the immediate time frame, I think courage looks like rest, because we cannot engage in this work when we ourselves are not in good places. Let me rephrase that. We can, of course, we can do anything, but we will not be effective, and we may even cause more harm.
Mm,
And we're no good to anyone if we're not okay. So there are a lot of Black women who are saying they're tired. And to them, I say, sisters, you deserve a rest. Sure, rest. I think we have to get right down to the basics. I don't think you have to be in a management role to be courageous. You just have to be a human being. And we have to relate to one another from a place of empathy and a place of openness. But we combine that with wisdom, because there are some people who are not safe to us. Now, there are people who, even though their political views are different than yours, when you talk to them, you realize that you have a lot more in common. Those people are in our families, they are in our communities, they are in our places of worship. Talk to those people. We have to recenter humanity of everyone, right? We have a tendency to talk about these big issues as if we're talking about widgets. Like when people talk about things, we forget that we're talking about human beings. We're talking about human beings. We're talking about human issues, right? Even things like tariffs. It sounds nice and academic, but let's break that down into what does that really mean for human beings. I had a professor in law school who used to say that she really hated when people talked about the law as if it didn't impact real people. We have to talk about it in the ways in which this shows up for real people. And we can do that. We can make spaces, and I talk about this in my TEDx, where we listen differently, we listen with empathy, not to necessarily agree, but to understand. I got to understand your perspective. I got to understand your emotions. And I have to be able to show you that I understand and I hear you and I see you, even if I don't agree with you. We have to be willing to give that human dignity to every single person, even those, crazy as it seems, even those who may be advocating positions. that deny us the very humanity that we are willing to see in them. And then we have to be willing to say, what is it that we connect on and agree on, and how can we work from there? All of us are wired for fairness, all of us. So, how do we bridge that understanding of equity? How do I bring some understanding of the life experiences of these people that you think are trying to take something away from you, while also understanding why you think they're trying to take something from you? Because what has happened is a very successful campaign of othering, of making people feel like these people are against you. If they succeed, it means you fail. How do we bridge that? And we only bridge that one person at a time. We bridge that relationships at a time. And I admit that what I am saying is going to land very viscerally with many people, right? For the person who has had to live with oppression, for the person who knows the reality of systemic racism, this is very, very unfair. For the person who's lived with misogyny and sexism, this is very, very unfair. Because if you look at the data and you look at the science, you are the one who is on the receiving end of oppression. And you're being made to feel as if you were the other. And now I'm asking you to engage in conversation with those who would happily set back the clock. It's hard, but I don't know that there's any other way forward. There is no other way forward. Not unless we're going to segregate and create different nations, and that ain't happening. We're kind of stuck together.
Even as I heard you sharing that, I could feel in my own chest, in my own gut, it tightening because one, I can identify with what you're saying. I very much can get in that place of us versus them, where it just feels like a fight and where right, like I just want to go on the attack. I don't want to have a conversation because, in my mind, it is not reasonable. There is nothing reasonable to be said. And yet, I mean, there's a million ways to analyze the election and what happened. Um, but I do think there is a lot that has come out that, for those of us who really are trying to change things and are committed to this work, that especially like as white women and allies, we can really get on our high horse and we can talk down to people. And someone recently told me that the Trump administration, they were really good at manipulating people. But for those of us who were really trying to push Kamala and the Democratic ticket, we were talking down to people. And again, that's a whole conversation, but I hear what you're saying, and it's kind of landing in that same way of really stepping back and being open to those conversations, which requires a ton of emotional regulation,
Mhm.
frankly, a ton of therapeutic support and a
Mhm.
supportive community,
Mhm.
because that's really fucking hard work. And I hear you in that is where we've got to be courageous, because it's not just scary work, but it's uncomfortable work. And it's
And
work we
painful.
don't want to do. And
Yes.
yes, which is why the courage is needed.
Yes. And I'm going to add one thing to what you said. You said that you feel at times it's going to feel like it's not going to make a difference. And you're right. This is where
Mhm.
wisdom comes in. Not all of these people want to be convinced. Not everyone wants what we want.
Yeah.
There are people who legitimately want a hierarchy of race and gender. And we need to understand that. Okay? The people who are driving this propaganda, they're not confused about what equity really means and what inclusion really means. They're not. They may come up with the sound bites to get the person who is worried about the economy to blame the immigrant farm worker who's just trying to survive.
Right.
They may be smart enough to do that, but they know what they're doing. And we got to be wise enough to know the difference because there's some people that what we're talking about, that's not going to work. It's never going
Mhm.
to work. And we also have to know when engaging in these conversations puts us at self harm, right? I'm not going to ask anybody to put themselves in emotional harm of engaging in conversations with people who denigrate your very existence or the contributions of your ancestors. And
Mhm.
that's why this is so slippery because we got to figure out, right? There's some portions of this. Like, for example, I'm not going to be one of those people. Like, I know churches love to show videos of people who reconcile and the black person who goes and talks to these KKK members and gets them to be converted. I'm not I'm not an advocate of that, right? I'm not going to say sacrifice yourself and continue perpetuating this thing that the only way forward is for the marginalized and the oppressed to walk around spraying the forgiveness holy water or whatever. I'm not suggesting that. I'm saying that there are a lot of people that are not quite far on that edge
Mhm.
that we may be able to bring in to the conversation of how do we create communities of belonging and not othering. But we got to recognize that there are others out there. There are outright supremacists,
Mhm.
nationalists, misogynists. They don't want women to have rights. They do not want us at the table. They do not want a table that is diverse and representative. They want to preserve the status quo. We got to recognize that those people, what we're talking about here, that's not the strategy for them. That's a different strategy.
So I know we're at time, but I do have one more question on this.
Oh my
Do
God, I can't
you
believe we're at time.
I know. Do you have thoughts on, especially like in the workplace, on how to identify those 2 sets of people?
I think when people show you who they are, like ancestor Maya Angelou said, believe them. A
Mm,
lot of times people do show you who they are. They do show you who they are by what they say and what they do. I think when you reach out and you begin having conversations with people, listen to what they say and how they say it. When you offer different perspectives and they're willing to listen and learn and go, oh, you have someone who is, look for people who are curious, look for people who are willing to learn, look for people who are willing to say, I didn't know that before. Look for people who are willing to treat other people decently. Because I think it's a mistake to just assume everyone who voted differently than you did is evil and bad. Some of the people that I have worked with the closest and made the most change with are people that I am so like, I'm over here on the political spectrum, they're over here. And yet, still, we both agreed that it was so important to create cultures of inclusion and belonging.
mm,
And they were allies and they were willing to grow in their journey. Um, and I learned a lot from them as well. So don't assume that just because somebody's politically on the other side of you, that you cannot work together.
mm,
But there are people who, by their language, by their decisions, by their statements, that they're not really trying to change. And sometimes they'll tell you they're not really trying to change. There are people who are coming in and saying, now that the tides have turned, right? This is their time to change everything. Well, those are people who that's their plan. Now,
Yeah,
as you engage with them, you may be able to get to the root of why do you think this is the approach? Why is it that you want to change this? And you may be able to convince them on that level. But as we dig down to people's why, it starts to become clear. It becomes clearer who are those that you convince and who are those that you cannot. And wisdom also means we also have to start protecting ourselves. Okay. Because for those who want to maintain the status quo, for those who don't really want to see the representation, you are not safe with them. They're going to be looking for ways to come after you. Look at the dismantled DEI bill. What are they trying to do there? They're actually trying to make it such that federal employees cannot be rehired if they had a job doing DEI.
I know. Yeah.
You know, I mean, so pay attention to what people say and do and believe them, but also protect yourselves. We have to get strategic about protecting ourselves. Um, and that may mean being strategic about what you share and what you don't share in the workplace. That may be strategic about your alliances in the workplace. That may be having plan Bs. You know, if you're working with someone who is openly sexist and now feels empowered, you got to take that
Mhm.
into consideration. I mean, the laws are still the laws, you know, all the titles are still there, the Title Nines, the Title Seven, the anti-discrimination laws, those things are still there. So we have to remember that there's a shift, but there are also some things that are still there. There are still a lot of organizations that internally are still committed because they understand there's a business case for this. We are not at our best if we're not leveraging the skills and the talents of everyone in the organization. And the election doesn't change that, you
Right.
know. And so internally, there are probably still a lot of allies. And even as these programs are under attack, there are people who still understand there's the propaganda and then there's the reality. We can't discount the contributions of half the population. We can't discount the talent and the gifts. And we don't want to lose money. So I think there's a lot more for us to work with than there is to not. People still have contributions to bring and unique insights and perspectives. They still have those. If you're a top performer, you're still a top performer. Go to work tomorrow. Be that top performer. Continue. And if you need inspiration, look at Black Americans. Is there any other group in this country that has been undercounted, undervalued, held back, obstacles put in their place, and yet still continues to shine, contribute, excel, even when their contributions are credited to other people? And we only learn about it in Black History Month, which, if some folks have their way, we won't even have, any Black history.
Mhm.
And if we need inspiration, let's look to them that we can continue to rise and rise and rise because we don't have a choice. We got to keep going. We got to keep moving. Rest if you need to, but we got to keep moving.
Corey, as always, you are such an inspiration. You are a truth teller. You have so much wisdom. And I always feel when I'm with you, I feel empowered. I feel as though I can be honest and vulnerable, and
Mm,
there is space for that. And also hope. There's always hope to move forward, resilience, courage, all of that. So, I am personally grateful that you came on to the podcast. And I know so many people who are listening also feel very grateful for your words of wisdom. For those who are interested in learning more about you and your work and how their companies could hire you, how can they find out more?
I am super easy to find. I have a website, KoriCarew.com, just spelled exactly like my name. You can find me there. I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me there. Um, in this time, I would love it if people would take 19 minutes and listen to my TEDx. And in there, I talk about what it looks like to choose courage. And we titled it To Interrupt Bias, but really, it's a framework that you can use for difficult conversations. It's a framework that you can use for conflict resolution. It's a framework that you can use in this time and in this season as we're trying to figure out how we move forward. So I would love it, appreciate it if you could watch it, share it with someone, practice those skills. um, but I'm super easy to find. Reach out to me. I would love to come to your organization and help you on how we can be effective leaders. How do we lead with courage? How do we lead with intentionality? How do we build high performing teams? How do we leverage everything that those around us bring so that we're not leaving talent on the table? And I say thank you so much, Heather. You say that I inspire you, you inspire me. And thank you for allowing us to have this conversation. I don't think I've had a conversation quite like this um, since the election.
Mhm.
And I say, let's not get into this fight till we're ready.
Yeah.
Take all the time you need. That's what I'm doing.
I'm going to put all of the links in the show notes. So for those of you listening, you'll also have easy access to that. Kori, thank you so much for coming
No,
back
thank you.
on to the podcast. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Heather.
Thank you so much for joining me for this week's podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, give the episode a like and leave a comment below so we can keep the conversation going. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a future episode or announcement. Listening on Apple, Spotify, or another podcast app, you can watch the video and join in the after show conversation by visiting hustleandflowpodcast.com.